In 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. Welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Edwards. Joining us today is Edwandro Magalhaes. Ewandro, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure, Kevin. Thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to be here and happy to address your and anybody else's questions on language and anything else leadership.
And folks, a few housekeeping. Ewandro is the Chief Language Officer at Kudo. He's also been the Chief Interpreter for the UN. He's a linguist. And that means he knows a little bit about language and how people interpret it differently. So Ewandro, the first question I have for you today is, why interpreting? How did you get into this profession?
Well, how I got into it is kind of different in terms of compared to how other people get into it, right? It's often said that interpreting as a profession kind of finds you rather than you finding it. So in my case, that was totally true. So I bumped into it by accident. And I've told this story many times.
Yeah.
I used to work as a clerk for the Houses of Parliament in Brazil. And I happened to spread the rumor that I could speak good English because I was bored out of my mind doing what I was doing, which was just pushing paper and so on. And I was looking for a better placement. And again, I had my CV under my arm all day. And whenever I had some free time, I was talking to people about what I could and could not do. So one day I get a phone call. And the question I hear is, Ewandro, are you wearing a suit and tie? Because there are places in the house that you can only transit through if you're properly dressed. And I said, yes, out of coincidence, I am. So yeah, come down to the office of the president, the speaker of the house. And I did, not knowing, not having a clue as to what I was getting into. And once I got into that little room, they said, listen, we have a guest coming. It's a member of the royal family. He does not speak Portuguese, of course, and we need somebody to mediate the conversation. So you're going to sit here, whatever he says, you spit that out in Portuguese and the other way around. So if he says anything in English, we want to hear that in Portuguese. Cool, right? I said, no, because I've never done this. I have no idea. But you speak English, don't you? And that's, again, in people's mind, all it takes is the ability to speak two different languages for you to be an interpreter. Long story short, I kicked and screamed and I tried to disengage from that all I could. My boss was like almost 7 foot tall and he kind of pushed me down the seat and said, you got this, don't worry. You got this. And before I know, people are in the room and the press is following them. There's a lot of pictures being taken and footage and so on. And the conversation starts. Gladly, it was a very easygoing conversation. Again, this is just chit chat for 20 minutes and kind of, pleasantries being exchanged and so on. And I was doing, again, the best I could to try and mediate the conversation and kind of proud of myself for even surviving that ordeal. But also scared to my bones, right? Because at every step of the way, you can potentially mess it up in a big way, right? If you get it wrong, you don't understand, if you say something wrong and so on and so forth. So at the end of that experience, at the end of those 20 minutes, I was, again, relieved, but also hooked. So the rush of adrenaline had been so interesting, so good, that I said, you know what, this is a lot more exciting than the mind-numbing work they're asking me to do. Right. So I started, again, making myself available for anything else that would come. And lo and behold, they had those ambassadors coming every week to present their credentials and so on, and similar conversations needed to be had. And I became the de facto interpreter to the Speaker of the House in Brazil. Again, training as I went and teaching myself interpreting as I went on the basis of just trying to do my best. So that's not what I recommend for people listening to this who want to break into the profession. The profession is a lot more organized these days. We're talking 40 years in the past, right? 30 years in the past, 1992. So now, of course, you got to go to a school and you got to learn the right techniques, and you need specific credentials to even break into some of the organizations, which is what I did. Later, I put my career on hold. I had already done this for like 15 years, but I put my career on hold, went to the Monterey Institute in the US to actually get a degree. So eventually I got a degree in conference interpretation. And from there, I went to the UN, and then many, many more doors opened to me by combining the experience with the degree.
Well, I mean, talk about being in the right place, at the right time. And then also creating your own path, doing something that's different. This isn't a traditional way to get into it, but through those experiences, you kind of, you set yourself apart from a lot of those other translators. But I also found interesting, you're a businessman too. I mean, you weren't just translating for people. What did you do right after you found this passion and you knew that there was a large need for interpretation?
My next move was a crazy one, because I had been employed as a clerk by the Brazilian Parliament, which was back then and still is to this day a dream job. So both of my parents had retired from that place. And it's the kind of retirement where you take home not just your full pay, plus, but also an added bonus of 20% just because you just retired. And you stop contributing. So when you actually move from being an active employee to being an inactive employee, you start getting 50% more of what you were making when you were actually working. So no, this deal doesn't exist anywhere else, on the planet, right? So what I did was, I was not happy. I was young. I was not happy with the kind of job I had. And this was too excited not to want to pursue further. So I quit. Mm-hmm. I just went one day. I said, you know what? I'm not happy here. So I decided to quit. And I recall my parents, panicking, and they even spoke of maybe sending me somewhere where I could maybe have some psychiatric evaluation, because they thought I was crazy, right? So I left the parliament and I set up a translation agency called Di Presse in Brazil, which I ran for 17 years. So I was no longer just doing the interpretation. I was now hiring other translators, other interpreters, and I became a language service provider. So I was in this business for 17 years. So I did become an entrepreneur at that point.
And so tell me about the transition from working for someone to now, owning an organization, being responsible for other payroll. And then also, I feel like, you mentioned earlier, this isn't the traditional way to become an interpreter. What skills did you have to acquire? What did you have to learn in addition to just English to Portuguese translation? Was it just focused on one language? Were there other languages? Tell me about the experience as the business owner.
My working languages back then were just Portuguese and English.
Okay.
In time, I added a few more. I added Spanish as I went, and many, many years later, I added French as well. I had some working knowledge of a few more languages, but nothing I could use professionally, like German and Italian. But I was also hiring talent in many different languages, right? At that point, it became an operation where you would come to our agency with any kind of request. And we did some major events back then. We were at a point one of Brazil's largest agencies, and we were all over the place. We started doing things internationally as well. But the transition was not an easy one. It was an exciting one because it made me very happy. And I'm mission driven. I can't do something that doesn't really speak to my heart. So despite all the bumps and the shortage of money in the beginning and so on, I didn't have 1 cent put away to actually, no savings, nothing that I could use as working capital. So we were just building the plane as we flew it, right? But it was very exciting. So my understanding from just looking around the people who were in the parliament, looking at some of the examples I even had from my parents and so on, is that this pays well. This is a good job. This is safe, but I'm probably going to be sick by the time I retire.
Right.
So it's no use to have a lot of money in the bank when you can't use it because you're just paying for doctors, right? So it became very, very apparent at that point that we're here to take a few risks and make something out of our lives. So and that was not the last time I did this. So later, when I also transited out of the UN to found Kudo, it was maybe a much bigger bet, because I was again turning my back to a dream job, a huge salary, good compensation, excellent perks, a full pension, a permanent contract, to come to the US and start this business from scratch, a startup that we didn't know had any chance of even growing, right? So again, I guess you can say that I'm a little bit of a risk taker, but it's all calculated risks. Yeah.
Some serious risk, and some serious courage as well to do something like that. But it seems like for you, Ewandro, it's come more natural and naturally. It just happens this way for you, which gives you maybe that certainty that you're comfortable with, if you will. I'm interested from just an interpreter's perspective, how you perceive language, what you look for in others' dialect. I know that we do these podcasts, and when I started, and we used to transcribe them, and I look at those transcriptions of Ewandro and I go, geez, I must have the vocabulary and the dialect of a fifth grader. My dialect is not proper. So what are you specifically looking for? What have you been trained? How have you trained your mind when it comes to analyzing language?
Interesting question. There's a lot of technicalities in what we do, right?
Sure.
The techniques that you employ in order to keep up with speed, in order to handle the different accents, in order to navigate content that you don't initially have. So if somebody says a word that you don't immediately find the equivalent for, and there are coping strategies to navigate around that difficulty until you land on something. These are all technicalities and so on. But the most appealing aspect of language goes beyond the technicalities. Language is a human right. And language is something that's deeply rooted in our identity. So we're having this conversation in English, and I'm doing my best to make sense in a language that's not my own. I speak it well. I've been trained professionally in it, but I show up as a different persona when I'm trying to speak English because my thought process is different. I'm trying to mix things that come naturally to me, but also with a lot of things that come from a different point in my brain where I find equivalence. It's like always constantly going to a shelf and picking the right book and pulling it out and reading from that book at every sentence, right? So it's an effort. When I'm speaking Portuguese, which is my mother tongue, I don't think of anything. So these things just occur naturally to me, and that's when you speak your mind. So if you talk to a man in a language that he understands, but it's not his native language, it goes to his mind. But if you talk to him in a language that it's his native tongue, then it goes straight to his heart. Right? I guess Willy Brandt, the German statesman, encapsulated it really neatly when he said, if I'm buying, then I'm happy to speak English with you. But if you're selling, if I am selling, I'm happy to speak English to you. But if you're the one selling and I'm buying, dann müssen Sie Deutsch sprechen. Meaning then you got to speak my language, right? So again, there's a limit to what you can do with a language that's not your own. And the whole notion of what's possible and not possible, they become different when you speak different languages. So multilingualism is not just allowing people to make sense, it's allowing people to show their true colors. And these colors are going to be totally different depending on where you are. There's a lot that goes into your speech that's dictated by the colors you saw, the faces you've been accustomed to, the kind of interactions you've experienced back when, as a kid, where you come from. And you bring all that to the table, but only if you have the tool to express yourself in a way that's rich and brings it all to the table. If I have to all of a sudden translate that into English, I will always do a poorer job than you would do in English. And that's why we use interpreters, because by expressing myself in Portuguese and entrusting that content to someone who fully understands it and can now give it a different clothing, but using native tools that occur to them in a totally different way, I come across exactly as intended. Because again, if the interpreters are doing a good job, because I'm not hindered by the things that I have to compromise on saying, because this is how I can say it, but it's not exactly what I mean. So it opens up a lot of possibilities. It makes people comfortable. It makes people come forward as they really are. So that's the appeal in language to me.
I can see why you like it so much, though. It's very interesting. I mean, it's hard enough already to, interpret or explain something in English to someone in their own native tongue, whether you're trying to get someone in business to do something or articulate a vision. Everyone's going to interpret that in a different way. For marketers, for brands, if you see real, what do you think? Do you think of real leaders? Do you think of sustainable in business? Do you think of authenticity? It's very difficult. And there was a quote that really stuck out to me, Ewandro, and it was like, I'm going to butcher it, but it's like the fallacy of communication is that's actually taken place.
Yeah.
So being in a role such as an interpreter for the United Nations, you have a very important role. What are some of the conversations that you've had to interpret for that actually have a deep impact in the way we live?
Again, interpreters are a funny bunch because you don't get to choose where you're going to end up next, right? So it could be the G20 meeting. It could be a bilateral between two heads of state, or it could be a community meeting where peasants are talking about the rights to a mayor or whatever. And in every meeting, there's beauty. In every meeting, there is something of value that you need to communicate. And people come with a lot at stake, and you need to be there for them. But being a diplomatic interpreter, which I was for many years, does get you into, behind doors that you wouldn't ever find yourself in rooms that you would never find yourself in. And you get to not only experience some of the some historic events firsthand, but you actually give voice to that. So when you see the news the following day, following, say, a bilateral meeting with between two presidents, what is actually quoted in the Brazilian newspaper are the words exactly as they came out of my mouth, if somebody was taking notes as I did this. It is not somebody else's rendering of what was said. It's my word choice. It's my contribution to it. And here's an interesting point. We think of interpreters as always impartial. I hear table and I say mesa, right? There should be an equivalent, an impartial equivalent to everything. And it's never like that. No. The mere fact that you are in the room changes the conversation. The conversation is going to be different because you are in it. And it's a good thing that it does, because I always have a number of choices when it comes to the words that I'm going to use, and they all carry different significance depending on whom I'm talking to. There's no such thing as a synonym, right? What I say for blue in Brazil or for red in Africa depends on whether I come from the savannas where there's not a lot of trees, or whether I come from a very lush part of town where red is nowhere to be seen, right? There are languages where there's no word for green because there's no such color anywhere around you, right? So there's no such thing as synonyms. But I've been privy to very, very interesting conversations. I recall, for example, the nuclear summit that I guess it was 2010, where not only do you get to witness what's happening, but you get a sense of, okay, I'm helping the world become safer. I'm helping people, deactivate some of those nuclear weapons out there and so on. And it gives you a very interesting, very good sense of purpose, just knowing that you were there and you were part of the conversation. It's always funny also when you see the communication happening between you and the head of state. I remember one day, I guess it was the G8 or G20 and so on. And all of a sudden the microphone's not working. We're in the back in the booth, right? And then it was the first big meeting President Obama was doing. And President Lula was about to speak, and I had the microphone activated, so they were listening to English. I was providing that English because Lula was going to speak Portuguese. And all of a sudden, the microphone fails. And all of a sudden, well, I can't hear anything, the president says. And then you press the right button, and before you go, you say, okay, is translation coming through now? Oh, now it is, thank you. So at that point in time, you're talking to the president. There's a communication exchange there between these two people, right? In addition to what you're going to say because Lula said it. So those are very interesting moments where you can tell he doesn't know, but he heard my voice, right? That's interesting.
I was going to say, talk about trust too. I mean, they're putting a lot of trust in you to understand the underlying meaning of what they say. Have you ever snuck in something, Ewandro? Ever snuck in, hey, we're actually going to take our army away or denuclearize or anything like that?
No, you can't. I mean, confidentiality is a big tenure of this profession, right? And you got to be careful. You got to be, again, as much as your presence may change the outcome of the meeting, your every effort is to not be there and get yourself out to the extent possible, right? So you need to be as impartial as you can. Of course, depending on the circumstances, this is going to change. This is a point that I often make. And even some of my colleagues, they get mad at me because there's this thing in everybody's mind that interpreters are supposed to say every word as they were said. That is true, but it's not true, right? You remember, for example, when President Trump was speaking at the United Nations and he was making derogatory comments about the Iranian regime.
Right.
The interpreters at the United Nations in those booths, they were getting every word exactly as heard. But back in Iran, there was an interpreter doing this live for the national TV. So he was hearing what was being said and so on, and he was watering down everything that was being said that was critical of the Iranian regime. And then everybody gets mad and everybody condemns the interpreter and so on. I was asked to share my views on that on BBC.
Sure.
And my point is, depending on where you find yourself and depending on whom the client is, your role is going to be slightly different. So if you're doing this on national TV in Iran, where it's an offense to even utter a profanity or to say anything negative about the government, you have no choice. You have to adapt to what the situation is. And that's the reason why heads of state, they walk around with their personal interpreters. Because this guy at this point is not just an interpreter, it's a personal advisor, a trusted advisor who knows what the message is. So if in the heat of the moment, I, the president, get carried away and start saying nonsense that goes against what we briefed, that guy's job is to also say, sorry, I didn't get that. Can you please repeat it? And give me a hunch, a hint that this is not going where we want it, right? And then it gives you a chance to rectify things, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, what's the protocol? If you get something wrong, like I'm thinking, like I remember hearing something about like the Russian president had said we want to bury like all Americans. It was interpreted so wrongly. He was more talking about like socialism and capitalism, and that was a problem. I mean, how fragile interpretation can be and what it can do for public opinion, especially in a day and age of Ewandro where things are so immediate. Someone just said something and then an interpreter came out and now it's all over the news. How do we recorrect this stuff? What are some of the things you're working on in terms of innovation, technology, improvement and advancement to rectify situations like this or to, I guess, increase the efficiency of correct interpretation?
The incident you're referring to was back in 1956.
Yeah, tell me about it.
When I guess Khrushchev was addressing ambassadors in Moscow at a function. I guess it was at the Polish embassy or something to that effect. And talking about capitalism, he said in Russian, the equivalent of, we will bury you. And that's how the interpreter rendered it.
Right.
And the interpreter had been, the interpreter to Russian presidents for a number of years and continued to interpret for those guys. And he went to his grave defending his version of it. He said the phrase as said could only be interpreted the way I did. Now, the nuance could be worked on, right? When I say I'm going to bury you, it means that maybe I'm going to do it physically and I'm going to be there and take personal satisfaction in seeing you die, which is how the West got it. Or it could mean I'm going to bury you because I'm going to outlive you. My system is better. So you guys are going to be long dead and we're still going to be around, right?
Right.
Which they later claimed that this is what they meant. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, right? And again, the trust between the interpreter and the guy plays a big role here. So, but it created all sorts of ways. I actually have a TED lesson on that, an animated video that opens with that. It's called How Interpreters Juggle Two Languages at Once. It opens with that particular incident. You will also recall, again, if you fast forward to, I guess, 2018, I guess it was, or 19, when President Trump and Putin met, and there was this huge thing about what was said and what was not said, and so on. Eventually, they wanted to go to the interpreter and recover her notes. Oh, I know of someone, another American, who was at the meeting, so let's recover the notes and let's reconstruct what really was said based on those notes and so on, which is, again, totally wrong, because the interpreters usually dispose of those notes immediately after a meeting, and they don't retain any information from meetings because they're busy just getting the equivalents and preparing the next meeting. They're not taking notes to later write a report, right? So it's all very relative. In terms of technology, again, we have witnessed a few major changes in how language interpretation is delivered, right? And we can talk about that next if you want. I don't want to get too long-winded, but basically interpretation there's always some major case that comes to the fore and changes the business need, right? When simultaneous interpretation started to be done, because in the past it was all done consecutively. I would speak and stop, and then you as my interpreter would render that, and we're both standing on stage. It's consecutive interpretation. We take turns. Okay. It's tedious and it takes time. And when the new system was introduced, where you and I speak at the same time, and I'm doing this simultaneously from a booth, it was right after the Second World War, when the Nazis had to be brought to justice, and they needed to get testimonies from people in 4 different languages at least: Russian, German, English, French. And because the Germans were so good at propaganda, there was a need for the trials to be fair, but also expeditious.
Just the Nuremberg trials?
The Nuremberg trials. So if they were, if the trials were too protracted, there was the fear that the Germans, being good at propaganda, would turn the tides to their favor, because there was no legislation to punish those guys. There was no law saying that this is a crime called genocide. They had to, create that as they went. And but that kind of crime could not go unpunished. So they needed to go fast. And that's when they said consecutive interpretation won't do. So we need to find another system. And it so happened that somebody had experimented with it and so on, and they started trying it, but everybody kicked and screamed. Then it got established as the new system. And you fast forward 75 years, now the world is in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. And now you can't go anywhere. I can't leave home. You can't leave home, but the meetings need to continue. The UN needs to continue to meet, the World Bank, the OAS, and just businesses need to continue to do, close deals and so on. So we needed a new way of delivering the interpretation where the interpreters are not in the room. And that's what my company does now. So the company we founded, myself and Fardad Zabachan and Parham Akavan, again, we had already been experimenting with this just to provide a flexible way of doing things the day you miss a flight. But it turned out to be, again, the timing couldn't have been more perfect, because when the world needed it, we had a solution that was already ready and tested, right? And now you can do this, you can do interpretation professionally at the highest level, working from a home office as an interpreter.
And for business leaders listening to this, what are some of the benefits or the needs for these interpreters for an organization like this, especially on a global scale?
Anybody who needs to talk to anybody else in a different place where they don't speak your language understands the need for professional language mediation, right? This takes the form of just having your website translated and localized in different languages with a local flavor. That's why you go online and you see Airbnb, for example, they have their website localized in 60 or 70 different languages, sometimes 2 or 3 versions of Spanish, Latin American Spanish, Mexican Spanish, and Spanish from Central Europe, right. Brazilian Portuguese, Portuguese for Portugal. Because not only do you want to speak the language, but you want to adapt it to the local flavor, right? Again, the whole notion of if you're buying, I need to speak your language, right? Right. But it also takes the form of translation of books and materials and so on, but also oral communication. So businesses for a long time have understood the need for language, but there's this notion that the whole world somehow speaks English, that English is the dominant second language and so on. So many people come to meetings like this and they struggle in a language that's not their own. And they end up with deals that are less than ideal. Right? I don't succeed in persuading you so well because in addition to the language, there are ways of saying it. There's intonation that goes with it. There's the body language that I also need to understand, depending on where I am. So businesses everywhere kind of understand the need. Only it was not affordable. It was not possible to jump on a call and fly interpreters to Tokyo and be in Tokyo for a 45-minute meeting. Now it is totally okay because I'm where I am, you are in Tokyo. Interpreters could be anywhere, and the meeting just takes place for 45 minutes, and that's what I compensate the interpreters for. No flying, no logistics, none of the accommodations that would otherwise have to take place. So it became something, again, that nice to have feature is now affordable and you can go to it. And Kudo and other companies make that available now through professional interpreters. So you can have it at the exact same quality. And that's new.
Ewandro, I have so many questions right now. I'm just fired in my brain. First one is this. Will there ever come a point where AI can do the same? Me right now, knowing kind of the inefficiencies of AI, I don't think so. I think you really do need a person to understand that, again, that cultural language, that subset, that underlying meaning of kind of what this is. But will AI be, ever be an option for something like this at scale?
That's the $1 million question. We can only speculate at this point, but given time, anything is possible, Kevin. So, and as more companies do what we do, as Kudo advances in what it does, we have millions of minutes of meetings done in pretty much any language where you have the perfect equivalent of what was said in English to the same message in German, Japanese, Chinese. So big data is accumulating to a level that wasn't possible before. You've had the same in written communications, translation, corpora, and so on for a long time. But oral communication, it's the first time we're amassing such a huge database of raw data that we can do a lot with, right? So in the future, a lot more is going to be possible than what has been possible so far. Now, consider this. If we're having this conversation and you don't like the color of my shirt, right? Or like you don't like the color yellow, and I'm being facetious, and I say, yes, sir, I see your point. Yeah, sure, and you never wear yellow, right? If you're not seeing this, you can't tell that I'm talking, that I'm being ironic because you aren't wearing a yellow shirt.
Right.
See, I'm just being ironic. The words that I'm saying contradict what the meaning is. I'm saying, oh, you never wear yellow. But everybody sees that you're wearing yellow right now, and this is me picking on you. So these are the kind of things that AI is going to have a harder time picking up on because it goes beyond language. This is not just even body language. This is a visual input that should go along with the language. So that's where the levels of complexity start to get so high that language is probably going to be the last thing that a computer will competently do. Now, if we're talking about a demo that a company does every day with the same jargon, the same knowledge, a pre-scripted kind of routine, you can train a machine to do that in no time, and you can even anticipate what the questions are going to be if you have enough raw material, right? Raw minutes meeting. So, and if, again, the environment is not too unforgiving, right? If you're talking about NATO and the UN and whatever, no chance. But if, again, this is just a company trying to sensitize millions of users about what they do, it's like that little thing where you go to a Chinese website, you have no clue what's there, and there's a button, translate. You click the button, it gives you the gist of what they're saying. There's horrible mistakes there, but it gives you the gist of what you're saying. So oral communication, because of the regional sayings, because of the many ways in which you can engage in conversation, is probably going to be the last frontier. But I am among those who believe that this will come to pass. It's a matter of time and a matter of where we apply our industry. Let me end with a quote, and with a joke that I heard like 20 years ago. They said that the Chinese had invented a machine that could immediately translate anything from English to Chinese, right? Anything, machine translation. Okay. And they called the ambassador for the inauguration of this big thing, the British ambassador to Beijing. And then they said, okay, say anything. And the machine is going to translate that into Chinese. And then he said, okay, so let's try this. Out of sight, out of mind. So it was still written translation. So they entered that string of text, out of sight, out of mind, exactly as said. And out came a series of Chinese characters. And then he said, okay, now please feed that back in, feed those Chinese characters in. Let's see what comes out. And they did. And out came a blind idiot. Okay? Out of sight and out of mind.
Out of mind.
So it's hard to argue that the machine didn't get it right.
Yeah, exactly. That was good.
And these are the challenges with communication. Right?
That's comedy. Who knew they invented a comedian? Now, I have a few more questions, and the first one is just based on what you said. There's so many different forms of communication, and there's so many different ways people like to learn. Are there any languages that are more difficult to interpret than others? I think of, just English or, German, anything that comes from the root of Latin versus characters in Chinese, Japanese. Are there languages that are harder to interpret than others for your interpreters?
You could argue that way. Again, difficulty in language is a relative concept, because if I try to learn Hungarian, it's going to be incredibly difficult, because there's nothing in my language that has any relationship to Hungarian. But if I was born in Hungary, then it occurs naturally to me. So if I was born in Serbia, then it's easy enough for me to pick up Russian. Well, for a Brazilian like me, it's nearly impossible. Not impossible, but it takes a lot of effort, right?
Sure.
So it depends where you're coming from and so on. Now, languages go by families too. So you have languages that are Latin-based or are Anglo-Saxon in nature and so on. In time, they start to share a few of those elements, and that's why you have a lot of Latin in English and a lot of Anglo-Saxon words also in other languages. So you could argue that. In terms of interpretation, the structure means more than the actual semantics or the relative difficulty of speaking a language. It has to do with the order of elements. So, for example, if you say in English that you close the door, you say, I closed the door, right? But if you're saying, because I closed the door, if you try to say the same thing in English, in German, the order of elements gets inverted. And then the verb, or at least a particle of the verb, is going to be pushed to the end of the sentence.
Right.
So if I'm an interpreter trying to keep up with what happened to the door, I have to wait until that last sentence comes in for me to actually know if the door was closed or opened, right? Especially in German, where they divide the verb in two. So aufmachen and zu machen, these are two different verbs, close and open. If I say, ich mache die Tür zu, it means I closed it. If I say, ich mache die Tür auf, it means I opened it. Only I can now interject 10 different adjectives to qualify the door and say that it's a blue door, a big door, a cheap door, and so on. All those are going to come before auf or zu. So if I'm an interpreter doing this in German, I have to grasp a lot from the context, much more so than an English interpreter would do, or a Brazilian Portuguese interpreter would do. So, and if you go from, say, English to Turkish, then it's complete reversal in the order of elements, right? Where the subject comes in the end and the verb comes somewhere else, and it's totally reversed. So that's what presents most of the difficulties. It's in the timing, because you got to wait for that little particle while retaining in your mind everything else that was said, because you need to spit that out after you hear the final word, right? So it's a bit complicated in that regard, yes.
Interpretation seems to be complicated and always has been. And there's a layer of trust, the individual has to have with the interpreter themselves, it seems like. What are your thoughts on things as powerful as the Bible, as the Torah, as an ancient philosophical book that's been interpreted over years and years and years? Is there any danger of that? And what are your thoughts on just the overall interpretation process that's gone through over thousands of years, I guess?
The person who translated the Bible into Latin, Jerome, who later was canonized as Saint Jerome, he's the patron saint of translators for that reason, right? And he used to say that translation is by definition an imprecise exercise, because you're making decisions all the time, right? Again, going back to the notion that synonyms don't exist. So you're always making choices. And when you make a choice, a lot of what you bring to the fore is there, right? What you think is important, what you think is relative, and so on and so forth. Jerome was criticized, heavily criticized, by some translations that he did of the scriptures. And he had to defend himself by saying that, again, establishing what translation really was. So there's a famous letter that he wrote to a senator called Pamachius, where he was under attack exactly because of that. And he was trying to explain to the senator in his defense that translation is not just merely replacing words. It's something else. And that even in the cases where you might make a mistake calling John, mistaking John for Frank, the purity of the intent is not tarnished because of that, minor alteration and things like that. So, and he goes back to the scriptures to show that even in the Gospels, even the apostles, they sometimes made those sorts of mistakes, which doesn't take away from the message that they were conveying, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, consider this. This is a guy who went to the desert to try and translate the Bible into Latin.
Right.
There were no Google Translate. There was no internet. There weren't even dictionaries. He had maybe a handful of assistants who could help him with this and that, but he basically had to learn those languages. Right? He did part of it from Greek and part of it from Aramaic, the original language in which some of the texts were. And there's always potentially some risk of loss there. So every time you present yourself to do what we do, to interpret and put in your own words what other people have said or written, you can expect some level of pushback and some level of criticism, and the critics will not be totally wrong. So again, it's part of that imprecision that goes into translating things from one semantic universe into another. It's not just in the words, and it's always going to be subject to criticism, right? again, over the years, once you have enough people doing it and so on, these things kind of equalize because you compare the many versions and you come to a place. But whoever did it first may have introduced a number of things that are not totally accurate, depending on where they're coming from. Right.
Interesting. Is it fair to say you need people to translate properly? The reason I ask that is you think about Rosetta Stone and just the ancient hieroglyphs and how no one's been able to crack the code. If there was a new alien species to come here today or a new language to form out of nowhere, would you need people that understand it first to communicate with?
You need people, but not necessarily translators or linguists. I guess it was Neil deGrasse Tyson who criticized that movie, The Arrival. You know the movie, The Arrival, where these guys come, the aliens come, and they're trying to communicate, and so they call a linguist, right? Which is a good bet. But he said, I would call a data analyst. I would call someone who can recognize patterns, who can look for meaning in different ways other than just compare languages, because we're talking about a language that we don't know, right? I guess it's the Voyager, and I don't know what probe it is from NASA that carries a plaque where we try very hard to communicate in different ways who we are. There's a drawing showing the position of the Earth. There is a golden disc with, greetings in pretty much every language on Earth. There is binary encoded information. There is a transistor. There is God knows what, right? In an effort to say, hey, try to make sense of this. We're giving you the message in many different formats. Maybe you can make a sense of it, which is, again, going back to Rosetta Stone, how they cracked the code, because the message was present in 2 different languages. It was the same message, 3 different languages. The same message conveyed in 3 different languages. And then after a lot of work, you can cross-reference some of those things and so on. Now, communication is basically, on Earth, a human phenomenon, right? You can argue that the dogs communicate, but they don't have language. Language is a human phenomenon. They have ways of signaling specific patterns. Like when I bark this way, maybe I'm in trouble. When I do this, it's because of that, I'm hungry. But they can't get pieces of that bark and combine them in thousands of different ways to actually talk about philosophy, right? Those elements of barking, they don't compose a language, right? They can't be used freely with an intelligent mind to actually communicate different meanings and different aspects and subjects and so on. It's all, again, canned messages, if you will. According, two whistles means this, 1 whistle means that. So it's like in the ancient times, it's the drums, right? They always mean something. You can't have a conversation and tell people about a book using drums, right? So humans, yes. For the time being, we do need humans, yes.
It's interesting, though. I wonder what your thoughts are on how someone can best be effective in a conversation. Because when you think about the dog example, like that's an emotion that's resulting in a bark. Oh my gosh, another squirrel, blah, blah, blah. Or same thing for a human. If somewhere to come and say you're working at a Subway and someone's coming in, they have a bad day and they're demanding their sandwich, you may take that the wrong way. Whereas in reality, they're just having a horrible day. They may be a great person. What are some strategies or what are some thoughts you have, I guess, Ewandro, on how someone can be present and effective in communicating and articulating a vision or a clear set of rules?
I forgot the name of the guy, but there's one couple on the internet that sell a package on effective communication. And on the spots that I've seen, the commercials I've seen, he starts by saying, talking is the most dangerous thing you will ever do. Because you can easily get in trouble just by talking, right?
True.
Talking is an immediate connection between your mind and your emotions to your tongue and how things come out. And how many times have you regretted something you said, right? So it has less to do with language and more to do, of course, with your state of mind and your emotional control, right? So, and the thoughts in that regard are more important than the language themselves. And you don't think in language, you think in images, right?
Mm.
When you think about what you did yesterday and so on, you don't tell yourself the story, I woke up and I did this. You just remember the images as they occurred to you, and you form a picture, a full picture of what your day was. So in that sense, language is an element that comes late in the trail. So the job is not really to work on the language. The job is really to work on your presence and your mindfulness about where you are and what your feelings are, and controlling that before they translate into speech.
Mm.
That's the difficult part.
I heard an argument the other day about the mask in public schools and teachers wearing masks. And I don't have a position on this at all. But do you think that's going to be a problem for teachers trying to communicate something? One, they already have a problem. I mean, they're trying to educate, little school kids. But two, is that going to be a problem for the young school kids in terms of their development of
the masks?
Language, wearing masks.
They're wearing masks.
And talking like this.
Yes. Yeah, it changes how you sound. But more importantly, it changes how you come across with your facial expressions. There's only so much you can grasp from what I'm saying through the words. The fact that you see me as we do this adds a different flavor and helps you come to the meaning of what I'm saying. And you have to consider that in schools, you have different levels of understanding. You have immigrants, you have people who don't fully have an understanding, say, of English, but you also have people who are hearing impaired, who don't totally rely on the words. They need to look at your lips. They need to look at your facial expressions and so on. And by imposing the mask, which is the right thing to do given the pandemic, if we have to live with that permanently, it's going to change how we communicate, and we'll have to find ways to actually do this. On Kudo, for example, we have sign language interpretation. Okay? And of course, the interpreters have a hard time understanding what people are saying, and the sign language interpreter cannot wear a mask, right? Because the intonation in sign language is given by the face. So if you sign a word and the word is, say, tomorrow.
Interesting.
It could be tomorrow. It could be tomorrow, and it's a question, for example. Guys, if you're a sign language interpreter, I'm totally making this up. Again, just trying to give you guys a notion of what I'm talking about, right? The example might be very poor. So it will change the way we communicate. That's most definitely yes.
Interesting. It's very interesting. And for people listening to this on audio, if you want to understand and get the visual part of the conversation, head on over to Crowdcast and re-watch this episode on there. Ewandro, it's been an interesting conversation to say the least today. I'm so happy we had you on the show today. I'm very interested in what the future beholds for Kudo and for interpretation and for people come together to understand a common message. So with that thought process in mind, Ewandro, the last question I have for you today is, what is your definition of a real leader?
Thank you, Kevin. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity. It was a fun conversation. So I guess we met that objective. I'm going to use that to share with the viewers a story that I think is very, very urgent. And again, something that is at the core of leadership and trust. We are witnessing a huge humanitarian issue with the situation now left in Afghanistan, particularly involving the language mediators that helped the U.S. troops and the allied troops communicate and be safe for a number of years. So it's now 20 years since 9/11, and for 20 years, the troops going to Afghanistan and before that Iraq have relied on interpreters who kept our troops safe and who not only allowed them to communicate, but also shared the cultural codes and again, allowed them to make sense of reality in ways that are the difference between life and death. As the troops get withdrawn, interpreters are being left behind. And these interpreters, because they aided the U.S. troops and the foreign troops, they become targets of violence, not only them, but their families. So there's a huge need to bring those guys and girls over to a point where they can feel secure and where they are not liable to this kind of violence until we can clear a way for them to immigrate either to the U.S. or other countries. this is a discussion that has been going on for a long time, and it goes back to the core of leadership, which is you don't leave behind the people who helped you when you most needed, right? There's a moral obligation, I guess, in helping these people out. I totally understand that this needs a process for people to actually be brought to a different country. There's a lot of risk involved. There's a process that needs to be followed, but we urgently need to expedite the process in a way that's safe, but that safeguards the lives of these incredible language mediators and who are basically war heroes, if you look at them right. So I'm going to end with an appeal that we start getting educated on this issue. Kudo is also getting educated on the issue and trying to help to the extent possible. I would invite our viewers to go to a web page called nooneleft.org, which is an organization called No One Left Behind, and they're doing all they can to, galvanize the community in finding a way to expedite this for the sake of these brave men and women who were left behind in Afghanistan. So if we manage to do that, we will have done what I think is at the very core of leadership, and that is to lead by example. And to, again, share a beautiful story of loyalty and love eventually, ultimately.
Ewandro is powerful and, just hard-hitting. It's very hard-hitting to wrap up this show, and it's unfortunate that that's happening right now. And let's try to get that link into the chat box here, nooneleft.org. People go and help out the cause. Everyone plays a role in this, and there are people struggling during this conversation that's very hard to comprehend. For Edwandro Magalhaes, I'm Kevin Edwards asking you to go out there. Don't leave people behind that got you there. And always, folks, keep it real. Thanks, Ewandro.